Hello, and welcome to the Dark Money Files, where we habitually shine a light into a murky world. This is the fourth of our special review of 2020 episodes. I'm Ray Blake, and with me is my usual partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Well, hello, Ray, and I'm slightly sad, Ray.
Why is that, Graham?
Well, because I've had a lot of fun doing these end-of-the-year specials, and this is the last one.
Well, yeah, so have I. Although we have, in the interest of full disclosure, had some discussions about this, and I think we've got a way to keep doing them for people who are interested in listening to this sort of waffle. So stay tuned to the end, and we'll tell you all about it.
Do you think this will be really popular in Belgium?
Hey?
Well, Belgian waffles, come on.
Can we move on now?
All right, then. I've had possibly the first of my stupid jokes of the day. May not be the last.
So we got as far as the end of September, hadn't we?
We had.
So, quarter four then.
Yes. Well, suppose the first big story of October, big kind of in global news events, was President Trump tested positive for COVID, sent a few ripples around the world of various degrees.
Yes, absolutely. Joining what looks like a fairly short list of world leaders who have publicly announced that they've had COVID. I suspect the real list is a little bit longer, not least of which because A, some people wouldn't want to disclose it, and B, some people might genuinely not know if they're asymptomatic, I guess.
Well, that's true. And I think we should mention not just world leaders, but Boris Johnson as well.
Well, indeed, yes, quite so.
Sorry, Boris. But you're right. And obviously it's an issue in some countries where they want to manage their news cycle more carefully than others.
Yeah, I mean, nowhere more than the US has it been quite so politicised. And I think, President Trump's COVID infection, very publicly played out as it was part of what seemed to be a bit of a circus.
I think you're right, Ray, and don't want to analyse this to death, but the one thing that did strike me was this use of the proof by anecdote ploy, which is the kind of, I got it, I'm okay, can't be that dangerous.
Yeah, and, most of the people infected with the condition could legitimately say the same thing. They were okay. They didn't suffer too greatly. But, it's the minority of people who do that means we all have a duty of care, really, to treat it more seriously than our personal symptoms might warrant.
I think you're absolutely right, and I suspect this may be a conversation for another day, but it has huge echoes of much of what's in Nassim Nicholas Taleb's writing about
the Black Swan guy, right?
You're absolutely spot on, and it's that and his other works are very, very interesting and worthwhile reading.
I think we could probably have an episode just on recommended reading for the AFC and compliance community.
Do you know, I think that's a really good idea, and maybe one on Black Swan events as well, but for another day.
Yeah, another day.
What else?
Well, there was a CNN story about Venus in October that I'm sure escaped many people's attention, as it did mine at the time.
Me too.
Funny sort of a story. It was the sort of story that you often see from CNN and some other news outlets, but I always associate it with CNN, which is, they clearly have to get an awful lot of content to cover themselves on slow news days, don't they?
Yes, even if some of that content seems a little contrived at times, I guess.
Absolutely. So this doesn't really qualify as news. It's a feature, I guess, isn't it?
Yes. So do you want to explain for the benefit of those listening what the story was about?
Absolutely. So CNN reported that it was suspected that Venus might now be habitable if it weren't for Jupiter's huge gravity and a highly elliptical orbit that it developed initially in the early epoch of solar system formation, which had the effect of moving Venus to close to the sun, with the consequences that we now all understand about runaway greenhouse effect and so on and so forth.
Yeah, but it's a slightly weird argument. I mean, you could equally argue that if some satellite hadn't smashed into the Earth, ejecting the moon, we wouldn't now have tides. But I suspect that would be the least of our problems. I mean, it's a slightly spurious argument, isn't it?
No, it absolutely is. And as I say, it doesn't really qualify as news as far as I'm concerned. But oddly, it was one of two prominent stories, for certain values of prominent, in the kind of autumn period, because there was another story in Nature about the discovery of some chemicals in the upper atmosphere of Venus that were associated with processes around life, and there was no chemistry to explain their appearance through any other means. So, I think we're used to life on Mars stories, but life on Venus stories are a little bit new. And the speculation is that, there might be life in the upper atmosphere of Venus, which, if true, is incredibly exciting, obviously.
Well, it is. I mean, obviously, Venus is a very methane-laden atmosphere, and methane, we know, is a particular source of all sorts of complex, proteins or whatever that can be the precursors of life. So, in some respects, not surprising. I guess the big thing is the temperature in the atmosphere of Venus, which is pretty oppressive. But
yeah.
We've found life in some fairly inhospitable places in Earth already, haven't we?
Well, they call them extremophiles, don't they? These bacteria and other simple life forms that seem to thrive in the most extraordinary conditions of heat and pressure and radioactivity and vacuum even, and so on.
Yeah, and I find that quite encouraging. I mean, it always reminds me of this great story about the Australian doctor who decided that a lot of stomach ulcers and other problems were caused by bacteria in the stomach, and he was ridiculed for years because everyone said, no, it's really strong acid and bacteria can't live in there. And because he went on to discover Helicobacter pylori, and a lot of us, including me, who had a Helicobacter infection, are very grateful for that fact because there is now a drug therapy to cure it.
Well, and in part, it's removed a substantial stigma, hasn't it, around ulcers that had always been blamed on a lifestyle.
Absolutely,
and quite a louche lifestyle at that.
Louche, but word, right? Louche.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I won't deny that I'm personally an advocate of quite a louche lifestyle, or certainly have been in the past. But it seems, a bit rich to look down on people who, it now turns out, have a bacteriologically derived condition rather than one that's been fed by less desirable habits.
Well, absolutely. I mean, the good thing that came out of that was that he proved it by infecting himself and curing it, and getting himself, I think, did he get a Nobel Prize for medicine? I believe he did.
Yeah, he might well have done, but I mean, it sets a bad example to younger scientists. So don't try that at home, kids.
No, it's not a great thing, is it?
No, I don't think we could advocate that approach more widely.
No. The other one that caught my eye in October, moving on, is over in Egypt, which is always a source of interesting stories given its antiquity. And they put on display 59 coffins that have been discovered that were home to priests and clerks, the final home, but dates from the 26th dynasty, which is, for those of you who are not up to date on your Egyptian dynasties, about 664 to 525 BCE.
That's ages ago, Graham, by any measure.
Even for me, Ray, that's quite a long time. But it actually, in the life of the Egyptian dynasties, it's not actually that far back, is it?
No, they were good for something approaching 3,000 years, weren't they? The Egyptian dynastic civilizations.
They were, and we need to remind ourselves that that's getting on for 1,000 years longer than we've currently had Christianity. I mean, that would take us almost up to the year 3000.
Yeah, quite. And don't start singing, Graham, please.
If there was the slightest chance that we could all meet up in the year 3000, no. I'd be really distraught at that.
Yeah, no, no, let's not go there.
No.
But yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating civilization and very much the template for virtually every civilization that follows it. And for every religion and religious movement. I think they can all trace their origins to those that arose in ancient Egypt, can't they?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And the other thing is how easy it is to lose a sense of time when you're looking back in time, because you think, the Egyptian dynasties lasted for 2,700 years, and back in the mists of antiquity you think, oh yeah, well, fair enough. But it's only when you contextualise it in terms of modern history you realise just how long that is.
I think we would find it very, very difficult to identify with someone who lived in Victorian times, for instance.
Yes, there's a website where they do, it's not colorization, it is actually recolouring existing coloured pictures and sharpening them, and it's extraordinary. I'll for another time I'll dig out the name of the site, but it transforms them from historic pictures to modern pictures, and the only difference is it has colour and focus.
I saw a colourised movie of New York in a previous century, which was breathtaking.
Some of them, there's pictures from the Napoleonic Wars in colour, and it is like looking at people today, maybe look slightly in costume, but it stops being history and becomes relevant. It's a very interesting process.
And the other thing that I always think about this is that often the biggest data set that we have about how people lived comes from their funerals, from their funerary remains and relics, and I'm not sure how much somebody who didn't know our civilization could extract from what we do with our remains and how we entrust people to the soil or the air.
Yeah, absolutely. It's back to Taleb again, isn't it? It's we draw our history from very narrow data sets because they're the only ones we have available. But you have to be very careful with how you deal with them.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was October for you. November, that there was an election. There's a forthcoming change in president, isn't there?
Possibly.
Yeah. So just ahead of the Panto season, we all got an excuse to say, "Oh no, he isn't." Oh,
yes, he is. Yeah,
and so on.
And Mr. Biden, look behind you, might be an idea as well. Oh.
Yeah,
it is extraordinary, and just when you think your credulity can be challenged no further, it is. But it's one of those. It's going to just have to run its course, and let's hope we can move on to a slightly calmer news cycle emanating from the US soon.
Yeah, no, I think so. And in all the speculation about what Mr. Trump may go on to do once he's out of office, I think we ought to linger on the idea of the British pantomime, because for those outside these shores who might not know about this tradition, it's a sort of seasonal theatrical performance which happens in every town of any size certainly in England, but more widely in the UK, I would say, which is an excuse for kind of end of year festivity, and typically it's the retelling of an old folk tale or a fairy tale with a dose of comedy, in inverted commas, ensured by miscasting people. So, for instance, the heroic male figure will be played by a woman dragging up as a boy, whereas traditionally the pantomime dame, an old, generally a middle-aged or an old woman in the cast, will be played by a man dragging up in quite obvious style as a woman, and this would be in very, very thick and exaggerated makeup and ornate clothes and so on. And it just struck me that there might be a role there for an ex-president in future years.
Well, yes, of course. The one other character you've left out is normally an animal of some sort involved. Sometimes it'll be a dog, as in Dick Whittington, but sometimes a rather larger animal, like a cow or a horse, which is traditionally composed of two people.
Yeah.
The one who loses the toss gets to be the rear end. So that could be a toss that President Trump would want to win, I think.
I think he might delegate to his former vice president in those circumstances, or would if he'd got any sense anyway.
Yeah.
So, let's watch that play out, but I think we're nearly there now.
Yes, I think so.
So also in November, we had news of Edward Snowden, didn't we?
Well, we did, and he's now formally applied for Russian citizenship. And I find this story is bizarre at so many levels, not least that a man who has gone out of his way to leak information from a relatively transparent system, albeit not so transparent around intelligence, but he ends up in a place applying for citizenship where they are significantly less transparent and a bit more careful even with their intelligence. So it's just got some bizarre twists to it, hasn't it?
Yes, I suppose so. And I had a couple of thoughts about this. I suppose the first is an extension of the enemy of my enemy principle, in that if you fear the wrath of a very powerful opponent, or in this case, a very powerful state, there's a lot to be said for aligning yourself with its biggest and most powerful enemy, on the basis that you're paradoxically safer there than you are with states that might ostensibly look a lot more secure and friendly. My other thought is that you can never quite tell when people publicly leak, whether they've
excuse me,
as it were, whether they've publicly revealed their entire load, or whether effectively what they've done is they've produced a trailer and sat back and waited for further offers. So, I mean, I don't want to impugn the guy's integrity in any way, but you'd be a fool not to think that might have been a motivation.
Yeah, the one thing I would say finally around this story is that if Mr. Snowden had been Russian and had done to the Russian intelligence services what he did to the US intelligence services, I would be concerned about drinking tea anywhere in the world after that.
Yeah.
Because it could make you glow in the dark afterwards.
Briefly. Yes, quite right.
And the one thing I don't think the US is capable of doing is sending operatives out to Russia with some polonium or some, heartbreak herb or whatever it was called, gelsemium or some other concoction to kill somebody in Russia.
Yeah,
I could be wrong.
I mean, I think it's capable of doing so, but technically, but hopefully not morally.
Yeah, you'd hope.
You would.
Or maybe they're so good at it, we just wouldn't. Really.
You never ever hear about the most efficient and effective criminal acts, do you?
No. On which subject? Criminal acts.
Yeah.
Leads us on to our next story. That's a good one as well, too, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, we've been largely off topic, but this one seems to bring us back slightly, doesn't it? The US Department of Justice seized $1 billion worth of Bitcoin linked to the Silk Road site.
Yes, Silk Road famously, of course, it was one of the first ever dark web sites selling drugs and all sorts of other paraphernalia, run by a guy called Ross Ulbricht,
otherwise known as the Dread Pirate Roberts.
Yes, I've been racking my brains I know that comes from some sort of game or something online. I can't remember.
It's from The Princess Bride.
Oh, is it?
Yeah.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, there you are. An obvious source of a online avatar.
Well, quite right. Yeah. I mean, that's given birth to all sorts of memes, including the rodents of unusual size, which I think is.
And probably it's got a bit more to it than maybe Captain Pugwash.
I suspect so. Yes.
It'd be quite hard to take someone seriously when their online avatar was Captain Pugwash, wouldn't it?
I suppose it would, Graham, yes.
Sorry, that just occurred to me.
Not something I've devoted a lot of thought to, but...
well, no, and there's a whole lot of mythology.
Perhaps I will now.
Well, I'm tempted to, but not going to go down the whole... There is a mythology around Captain Pugwash, which, for those of you who don't know, was a UK cartoon series from way back when. And there's just a complete load of fake news about some of the characters, none of which is true, but would have you believe they all had some sort of sexual... connotation.
Yeah, a false mythology.
False, yeah. Can you believe that at this day and age? Fake news.
It's a very early instance of fake news, isn't it? I mean, I remember those stories circulating in the 80s when I was at school.
I think fake news has been around a very long time indeed. It's just easier to disseminate.
Every generation thinks it's invented everything, doesn't it?
Of course. It was ours, in fact, that really did.
But I mean, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that even though the Department of Justice seized that Bitcoin hoard as recently as November, when it was worth $1 billion, it's now worth considerably more, isn't it?
Well, yeah, and it depends on what day you're listening to this, because it could be anywhere. But it's been around 2 billion. It's more, it's as near as damn it doubled since November. It could halve again by the time you listen to this, of course. But do you remind me? Did you ever read that quote by McAfee?
You'll have to narrow it down. He said some really wacky
stuff. He said some very strange. I mean, he is a troubled man, but he did say a year or two ago that if Bitcoin wasn't $1 million per coin by 2020, he would publicly chew off his own genitalia.
Right, well, that's one to look out for.
Okay. CNN, that could well fill a minute or two.
Yeah, okay, well, why not? Why ever not? Shall we move on to December?
I think we should, Ray.
I mean, December is traditionally a slow news month, but there was no slowing the pace, was there, this year?
Well, no, and clearly some of the most important news coming out is news that's now going to be an absolute lifesaver, and I mean that in a very literal sense, which is the approval of various vaccines for COVID, which we have struggled to we've tried to avoid talking about, but I think we've got to have a chat about COVID and new variants and the fact that we've all become armchair virologists.
Well, we have, haven't we? And it reminds me of the time when mad cow disease was a thing, and we all learned the language then of prions and new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and everything, and suddenly we were at that time as well.
Yes.
All epidemiologists, weren't we?
We were. I mean, I did have a little dig here, and I was actually astonished about how many different types of vaccine there are. I've managed to find vaccines that are live attenuated, recombinant vector, toxoid, subunit, polysaccharide, conjugate, and nucleic. And I think there's a few more other than those.
Well, yeah, bring them all on, frankly.
I mean, it's a lexicon that we could not have even begun to imagine at the start of the year, could we?
No, absolutely. I mean, if you look at my New Year's resolutions for last year, very few of them had anything to do with spending quite so much time at home, Graham.
No, and you and I probably have one thing in common. We've never been the most gregarious of people, which has probably been a slightly saving grace this year in terms of adapting.
Well, yeah. I mean,
reasonably well.
In the past, well-meaning people have often advised me that I needed to get out more, but those voices have been silenced somewhat this year, I'm pleased to say.
Yeah, it's just how many things have been turned on their head. Like we're now being encouraged to walk into banks with a mask on.
Yes, yeah, which in former milieu might have been frowned on.
Yeah, and who knew that the Good Samaritan would be the person who crossed and went by on the other side of the road? It's just turned the world upside down.
It's all mad, isn't it? But, hopefully we can see an end in sight now, some sort of return to normality, whatever that may be.
Yes. So let's do a story which I think really deserves an airing, partly because China's had a not very good press this year, and partly because you and I both love science, and this is just one of the best stories ever.
The Chang'e 5.
Yeah. So take us through it, Ray.
This is China's flagship moon mission, which was extraordinary for a whole number of reasons. And there were 4 components to the mission that they put together. First of all, there was the lunar lander, which went down to the surface of the moon, dug 2 meters down, and collected something like 2 kilograms of lunar rock from beneath the surface of the regolith. Collected it, shepherded it to an ascender vehicle, which then took off and returned into lunar orbit, where it joined the lunar orbiter that was waiting for it, which then took 4.5 days to come back to the Earth, transferring its load to the re-entry vehicle, the returner, which then detached and successfully landed with cargo intact in Inner Mongolia.
It's just an extraordinary story. It's just a triumph of technology and engineering, and just hats off to the Chinese, who don't get credit for just an amazing piece of research and adventure.
Yeah, and there were a number of things that make this a superb mission. I mean, one of them is the fact that rather than picking out the easy routes and the easy options, they deliberately went for the more ambitious stuff. So they didn't land in the middle of a flat basin. They landed somewhere astonishingly inconvenient, where they thought they might get better samples.
Yes, it was in a very volcanic region, I think, and they were after much younger rocks than previously gathered. Although young is kind of relative, isn't it?
Yeah, oh yeah. These were young saplings of a mere 1.2 billion years age.
Yeah, so much for the Egyptian dynasties.
Well, quite so. But I think our reluctance to look in a more nuanced way at China, at Chinese society and Chinese accomplishments is a troubling one. We're entirely capable of lauding scientific achievements of virtually any society or regime, and seeing them as something separate from that regime's politics. But we seem to have a blind spot when it comes to countries like China.
You're right, and we tend to ascribe all sorts of fairly negative reasons for their ability to do these things, whereas actually I think they have the same as us, inquiring minds, and they want to rise to those sorts of challenges, which is brilliant.
Yeah. Okay, good. There was one more science story, wasn't there, in December? I mean, we seem to be talking about science an awful lot, but I mean, it interests us, so why not?
Absolutely, and we slightly alluded to this in an early episode when we were talking about mammoths, didn't we?
So this is the fact that a rhino, or more specifically a woolly rhino, was unearthed in the extreme north of Russia.
Yes, I mean, which instantly tells you something, which is that the permafrost hasn't always been there.
Well, quite.
Talk about ice ages and different climatic events on Earth, and obviously northern Russia at some point was at least habitable enough to support, albeit woolly, rhinos. I mean, I didn't know that rhinos ventured that far north, if I'm honest.
No, absolutely, but the fact that it was woolly seems that this wasn't a random one that had wandered thousands of miles beyond where wisdom would suggest that it should, that it was part of, a local population. There's a lot more to find out about this, and unfortunately, the conditions, the preserving qualities of the cold climate and environment there means that there's quite a bit to these remains. There's lots of intact soft tissue, so we've got part of the intestines, we've got the thick hair, we've got some fat as well. So there's a lot more to be found out about this creature, which died sometime between 20,000 and 50,000 years ago.
It's just amazing. And I believe that the thinking is that it fell into a lake of some description and drowned, and then probably froze fairly soon thereafter, which is why the soft tissue is so extraordinarily well preserved, which makes me slightly more inclined to go and have that 3-year-old burger that's been in my freezer for
Don't do it, Graham. It's not worth it.
But because, I mean, it begs all sorts of questions, doesn't it? The recovery. I know they haven't been able to get it back from northern Russia yet because the road's just not passable. But I mean, I presume they'll be able to extract good quality DNA from these tissues.
Yeah. They'll be able to carbon date it, so they'll get narrow down their estimate to a bit closer than the nearest 30,000 years.
Yeah, and I think they'll be able to extract, some of the partially digested food that probably sit in those intestines. So it'll open up all sorts of interesting botanical as well as biological investigations, because it would tell us a lot about the flora and the fauna that was around at the time.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I wouldn't advise that anybody entertains ideas of doing a Jurassic Park on it, obviously.
No, that's probably a step too far. But I have heard tales of them, potentially retrieving seeds from these stomachs and being able to germinate them, which is just extraordinary.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. Well, I think we've just about done the year, Ray. So do you?
I think that's it. We've reached the end of 2020. Thank goodness for that.
Well, it wasn't. Well, it was a remarkable and memorable year, but not necessarily for the best of reasons.
No.
But we've got some plans. So why don't you tell our good listeners what some of those plans are?
Absolutely. Why not? Well, the Dark Money Files will be back very soon in more conventional format, sharing compliance and anti-money laundering related news and information and educative content, which seems to be very popular. It has been, will always be completely free. You'll never be asked to pay for that core content. But as 2020 has rolled out, we found that kind of traditional business models aren't quite as successful as they have been in the past. So effectively, we are looking at ways that we can monetize kind of around the edges of our core content. And one of the things that's really surprised us is that this content that we've put together just for a bit of fun, unrehearsed, unscripted, off the cuff largely, has gone down fairly well, in a similar way to how some of our live appearances always went down. And we've stumbled on an idea or two for seeing if we can kill multiple birds with one stone. I think it's fair to say, Graham.
Yeah, I think that's right. We don't want to extract lots of money from people, but a small contribution, and in return provide them with something which is entertaining and informative and worthwhile, seems to be a reasonable compromise to make.
So we're setting up a Patreon, like so many podcasters do, which enables you to contribute to our costs and in return get some additional premium content from us. Now, we've given some thought as to what that might be, and one of the things that we'll do is give you early access to our podcasts, maybe 2 days earlier than anyone else gets them, with some topping and tailing as well, so you get a little bit extra before and after. That won't affect what goes out in the main podcast, which will contain all the important, relevant and necessary stuff. This will just be a bit of old flannel from us, which for some reason people seem to value. We'll also look at doing a second podcast feed purely for subscribers, which has got more stuff like this, frankly, which we can use as an excuse to have a bit of a chat and be overheard by a wider audience. I've got to tell you, we're going to have this kind of conversation anyway, so we might as well record and publish it. Do you think, Graham?
Oh, absolutely. There are some I can think of we've had, Ray, in the past, and you think, I wish I'd recorded that, because we've gone into some extraordinary, highways and byways of knowledge. And it's one thing we do both share. It's this incredible interest in some of the more esoteric things that happen in the world, but which often reveal some quite fundamentally interesting, broader truths. So I think it's a great way to go.
Absolutely. So if you're happy with the traditional Dark Money Files podcast feed, you need do nothing at all. If you want to contribute to our running costs, or if you're at all attracted to either the Dark Money Files After Dark secondary podcast feed, or getting a bit of premium topping and tailing to your podcast feed from us, or any of the other stuff that you tend to get from Patreon subscriptions, which we'll review and add to from time to time, then we will invite you early in the new year to log on to Patreon and become a subscriber.
We will indeed, and it will give us a really good opportunity, I hope, to get to know and actually interact with many more of the people who listen to our podcasts.
Yeah, so when we do resume live activity, you'll have priority access to those events and much more, hopefully.
Yeah, so lots happening in 2021.
Frankly, Graham, I'm looking forward to it.